Hello everyone, my name is David McMurdo and welcome to Experiential Spirituality episode 31, God Has Judged. As ever, there's a link to my Twitter account through the description box below. You can buy my book through a link in the description box below, and you can ask me anything through Curious Cat through a link in the description box below. It's kind of strange that more people don't use Curious Cat. There was a period where it was really popular and just about every YouTuber linked to it regularly, but that died very quickly. And I'm the only one I know that actually uses Curious Cat now, so I don't know why that is. It's been a bit of a strange 2 weeks since I last made a live stream because I've entered into one of those reflective periods, which happens every so often because being souls in this world, it's like being a fish out of water to some degree, and you do have to recenter to a degree. So in my mind, of course, I want to get on with all of my projects, I want to get on with developing, writing and so forth. But spiritually, I just wasn't there, and I knew it was time for a recentering. So basically for the last fortnight, I'll be honest with you, pretty much all I've done is lie around reading and listening to spiritual material, just to bring myself closer to home, as it were. Of course, we never truly leave home, but again, as souls in the world, we are like fish out of water, so it does one good to try and center yourself every now and then. That's why spiritual individuals, mystics like the Apostle Paul, emphasize the importance of focusing on high spiritual thoughts and things like that, because it's easy, even if you intellectually understand the truth and even have glimpsed the transcendent truth to some degree, it's still easy to become lost in worldly things for as long as you're in the world and fall away, as the Bible would put it. So the last 2 weeks have been fairly uneventful in worldly terms, but very beneficial in spiritual terms. So one interesting thing that happened was that it was just Monday in fact, I was looking at my local newspaper and I saw an article about a local guy who had written a book, and the book was this book, Scottish Legends Fit 5 Mythical Monsters. And the way the news article explained the book, it very much sounded like the book I was planning to write. You know, I've told you about it. What I am planning to do for my next book is that there's 7 mysteries in the Highlands of Scotland that I'm going to go out and explore and see if I can uncover the truth behind them. And so what I had planned for my book was that each chapter would focus on one of these mysteries. I'd begin by laying out the history of that particular mystery, and then I would talk about my own thoughts about that mystery before going out to look for it, and then the final section of each chapter would be essentially my account of going out to look for it, whether it be the Loch Ness Monster, these giant cats, or what have you. So that was my plan. So when I saw this news article, I thought, oh wow, I think this guy might have just written the book I was going to write. So you know what I'm like. I have no problem at all approaching complete strangers and talking to them about bizarre subjects. So I contacted the guy. He lives in a town about 20 miles away, Mullins, as you can see there. I contacted the guy and I said, you know what, I think you might just have released the book I was about to write. And we got into a very interesting conversation. It turns out he's got a background in psychology. He studied psychology, specifically the psychology of consciousness and spirituality. And at one point in the conversation he said to me, presumably because he was aware that I'd also written a book, he said, you know, it's funny because I was planning to write a book about world spirituality. And I said, that makes us even then. You've stolen my book idea and I've stolen your book idea. Now, as it actually turned out, his book is not the book I'm planning to write. What his book is a collection of accounts of these different creatures. So it's a collection of folklore, which I'll get onto in just a moment. But the first thing I asked him was, you know, do you have in your book any mention of the big cats, the Sioux Seath? And of course he knew all about it, and he does talk about the Sioux Seath, the phantom cats, in this book. And so we had an interesting conversation about that, and he began telling me some local tales that I'd never heard of. there's a small place called Walton, a few miles away, and he talks about there's supposed to be a ghost of a little girl that appears on a certain part of the road. So he knows all about this stuff. So I had a really interesting conversation with him, and of course I ordered his book. Now, as I said, as it turned out, this book is not the book I'm going to write, because the book I'm going to write involves me looking for these things, whereas this is a collection of the folklore regarding these creatures. But I must say that if he had written the book that I was going to write, I wouldn't have minded at all, because it's not an egoic thing for me. Like when I wrote this book, it was because God wanted me to, and I could see, even in material terms, that there was nothing comparable to this out there. Now, if someone, while I was writing this book, had released basically this book, I would have said, well, that's great, the book is out there now, I don't need to do it. So it's not like I'm writing these things because I want these books out there with my name on them. If someone else is going to write them first, then that's great. So I wouldn't have minded if this book had been the one I intended to write. It just isn't. But it's a really lovely book, and I wrote a review for him on Amazon after I'd finished reading it. This book arrived on Thursday and I had it read by Friday night. I wrote a review for him on Amazon, and I've linked to this book, his Amazon page below, so you can go and look at it if you're interested. But as I said in that review, when I first saw the title of this book, 55 Mythical Monsters, I thought, 55, that's an odd number. That's like an arbitrary number. But having read the book, I understand why that number came about. It's because he pretty much covers every possible creature from Scottish folklore. There's even some in here that I've never heard of before. And so it was a really lovely read, as I said in that review. When I was growing up, I always loved stories about, mythological stories. When I was growing up, I was primarily exposed to Greek mythology. I loved that. My stepdad used to read Beowulf to me. He used to read, even, I say fictional, I mean, technically they're all fictional, but he once gave me this graphic novel of The Hobbit that I really, really enjoyed. And so yeah, I grew up really enjoying collections of stories and folklore from around the world, and reading this book, it reminded me of those books that I loved to read growing up. And even now, those books probably, they either began my interest in these subjects, or they just, more than likely, they reawoke an interest that was inherent to me from past lives and so forth. But regardless, this book reminded me of those books I grew up reading, and because of that, it was a very cozy, very comforting read for me. And it actually also reminded me, because it's a collection of folklore, it really reminded me of another book that I've always really enjoyed. And I've talked about it before, but it's a Fireburn by Ken Radford. It's a really obscure book. I came across this by accident in high school. In my high school, this was hidden away on a shelf somewhere, a really obscure book. And I rented it out in high school. I absolutely loved it. And then later in life, I remembered it, and I tried to track it down, which at the time was difficult. It might be easy now, but I got hold of a copy. And what this is that just as how this book is a collection of the folklore about the mythical creatures of Scotland, this is a collection of folklore regarding witchcraft from around the United Kingdom. And so it contains a lot of local accounts about witches, but in the centre of the book there's also accounts from trials that took place, so legal documents from trials, witch trials that took place. So it's a really, really fascinating book, and this one reminded me of it. Now, Aaron, he releases his books in the same way that I do. He self-publishes them on Amazon, but as you can clearly see from the cover, I could use some advice from him on the cover, because as you know, when it came to my own book, I just used Amazon's own cover maker thing, because I did care. I did want the cover to look good, but it wasn't something I was too concerned about. So I just made my cover look as good as I could with the Amazon editor, and then left it there, because obviously I'm more concerned with what the content of the book is. But Aaron here, assuming he himself is not an artist of some kind, he seems to have commissioned some piece of artwork here. It's a really lovely image there. So yeah, I could definitely use some tips from him regarding how to to make a nice cover for Amazon. But it was a really nice find. You know, it's really nice to come across someone in the local area, just 20 miles away, a town that's not only close by, but a town I've lived in twice. I lived in 2 different places in that town, and it's just nice to know that there's someone nearby that is also like myself, has an interest in these kind of obscure subjects, and that also, you know, he's kind of independent in putting his own books out there. So that was a really nice discovery for me. And as I also said in that review that I wrote for him on Amazon, what I really enjoyed about this book is not the major creatures that most people know about. Like, everyone knows about the Loch Ness Monster. What I really enjoyed about this book is those stories that involve the lesser known creatures. Again, some of them that even I'd never heard of. And I believe it's in the section on kelpies. There's a story from this town, Thurso, which I had heard before, but it was nice to read it again. If I just give me a second, it only just occurred to me to perhaps read this. So I'm sure there's a kelpie story from Thurso, and again, this is a collection of accounts, and perhaps because he has a background in psychology, sometimes he also speculates as to why these myths might have originated in the first place. You know, what was going on in the lives of the people of the local area that would have given rise to such myths. But it's funny because even though, you know, he's writing his own books and he's got a background in psychology, if you look at him, you know, if I saw him in the street, I would think he was a bouncer. He looks like a bouncer, and honestly, he seems like a very tough guy. Sorry, this is really, really bad to be looking for a book while I'm doing a live stream. But there was definitely a story from Thurso. Maybe it wasn't about a kelpie, maybe it was about the other variation of a kelpie. I'm just scanning for... Okay, maybe... Where's the... Yeah, there's a more evil version of the kelpie called the usage, or I can't pronounce it. It's a Gaelic word, and even though I'm in the far north of Scotland, I don't speak Gaelic. So scanning. Well, maybe I'll talk about it in the future, but yeah, it was a really lovely book, and again, it was nice to encounter that individual in the local area. So another thing that happened was that you may recall, I think it was in the last live stream I made, that I contacted this big cat expert down in England. This is a guy who's been looking, well, let's just say he's been researching these phantom cats for the last 25 years. And so I contacted him, and what I did in my email was that, and I want to emphasize, I want to say that he has been researching these cats, because I don't know if he's actually gone out and looked for them or not. There's a difference between researching and actually going out to try and hunt them. And when I say hunt, I mean obtain proof of. I don't mean kill. So I wrote to him, and in the email I said to him, you know, I've got some ideas about these big cats, and what I said to him was pretty much what I've explained to you before. First of all, I explained my own encounter with these cats. In fact, I directly quoted from my book to him, and I basically asked him, you know, it's obvious that there has been instances of physical cats being found out in the country, big cats. But I put to him, you know, how open are you to a supernatural explanation? Because as I put it to him, I find it hard to believe that such animals could exist without being detected, especially up here, because as I've said before, the land up here is very flat. It's hard for me to imagine that there's a significant population of these creatures existing out in the wild that have remained undetected for so long. So I put it to him, how open are you to the supernatural explanation? Just give me a second. He got back to me in an email response. Sorry, this is so bad. Okay, never mind. Okay, so his email, he said to me, "Hello David, thanks for your interesting email. Yes, a great many people have had close encounters with these big cats, and the great majority of them keep it to themselves, some not even telling their close family and friends for fear of ridicule. Witnesses often mention the fact when they contact me that is, I'm the first person that they've ever spoken to about their experience. I have studied wildlife and its behaviour ever since I could read, and although these British big cats are obviously tangible creatures due to their occasional depredations on sheep, especially, most of the sheep, goats, foals, etc. are literally killed in a savage attack quite unlike the quick and precise method employed by known species, such as the leopard and the puma, but also unlike the aftermath of attacks by dogs, loads of wool everywhere and bite marks to the legs and rear end of the sheep attacked. I often get called out to recent deer kill, and generally upon skinning the neck area will find the telltale canine teeth puncture marks of a big cat, similar to what I would expect to find left behind by a leopard or a puma. Also, I receive reports of these big cats following people for a distance before retreating into woodland or undergrowth, but on the flip side, as you mentioned, they sometimes, when close up, totally ignore the witnesses. Now, the reason he said that to me is because I related my own experience to him of encountering these big cats. And for those of you who don't know, to put it briefly, my friend and I were wandering the countryside on one night about 15 years ago. It's about 15 years ago. And one of these big cats passed right in front of us, like about 5 or 6 feet in front of us, and it didn't even acknowledge our presence. That's what immediately made me. But besides the logistical difficulties, you might say, of these creatures existing undetected in a place like this. And these sightings have been going on for so long now that there would have to be a population of them. And it's hard for me to accept that a population of cats like that could exist so undetected for so long in a place like this. And just the fact that this cat didn't even acknowledge us when it passed us, there was something otherworldly about it. I'll put it that way. So that's why he said that to me. So continuing with his email. Plus the fact also that up to this present time, and with the thousands of 24/7 trail cameras out there in the UK, we still have no clear close-up scaled footage of one of these big cats. And if we do have some, I believe people are holding on to it. As you can see, I have no illusions that we have large-sized wild cats similar to leopards and pumas living and breeding within the UK, existing well on our abundant prey species of rabbits, pheasants, mice, voles, and of course their favourite diet, small deer, such as roe. But there is more to this subject than meets the eye. An open mind is always required with a fascinating subject like this one. Regards, Frank. So, I wish he'd elaborated on this bit, but there is more to this subject than meets the eye. Now, does he mean that he has ideas about these cats, some supernatural ideas about these creatures as well? Or was that the kind of thing you say to someone when you don't really take their idea seriously, like, he's just throwing me a bone just to be nice. He's not really going to entertain my supernatural proposition, but he's going to throw me a bone and say, you got to remain open-minded kind of thing. I can't tell what that is, but that was the email I got from him, and obviously I was grateful to receive a response. So he's very clearly in the mindset that these are physical creatures. And so, because this book is not the book that I intend to write, I'm still going to write my book, and I'm still going to go out there and look for these creatures, but the fact that this book does exist, it is going to change the emphasis of my book, because there's no point in me just restating things that Aaron already did perfectly well in this newly released book. So I'm going to emphasize more the hunting part of things. I might call the book Hunting 7 Mythical Creatures of the Highlands or something like that. But I'm going to emphasize that bit more. So the book is still going ahead because it's different from this one, but I'm going to emphasize the hunting bit more. As for how I'm going to do it, well, first of all, I've got all the equipment I need now. Just this week I got a coat I need, so I've got my hiking jacket, which looks like body armor for all intents and purposes, but it's just a hiking jacket. And this week I got a really long coat, but it's a really tough long coat. So yeah, because over the last few months I've been gathering the equipment that I'll need to do all of this, and if you've watched my live streams you'll know that. As for how, and again there's 7 mysteries I'm going to be investigating in this book. When it comes to the big cats, my plan is simple. We kill the Batman. No. Well, first of all, there's a hot spot for these cat attacks. And as Frank said, the fact that livestock are killed in these attacks would indicate that they're physical creatures, but who says we're not dealing with both here? This is a very complicated mystery, and that's what makes it so interesting to write about. But I'm going to work on the assumption that they are physical creatures that can be tracked and caught. But as Tate says in the chat, scat and tracks would be present if they're physical beings. That's what one would expect. Now, there have been tracks found, and when they're sent in, it's left kind of ambiguous. And just to remind everyone, these incidents up at this place called Betty Hill, these attacks on livestock, they grew so severe that Police Scotland themselves opened an investigation into it. Now, that's all anyone heard. Police Scotland opened an investigation. So what I was going to do was put in a freedom of information request to get the details of that investigation. It turns out that someone's already done that, and it's already been publicly made available, and there's not much to know, unfortunately. They didn't find anything. So the obvious place to start would be at Betty Hill, which seems to be a hotspot for these attacks. And these attacks have been going on for decades, by the way. It's not like this is in the last 10 years. So I'm going to work on the assumption that they're physical creatures that can be caught, because if they are what I call ethereal echoes, as I explain in my book, then there's nothing I can do except meditate there, essentially. So I'm going to work on the assumption that they're flesh and blood creatures that can be caught, and given that cats are the hardest, or felines are the hardest thing to track in the world almost, I'm going to use bait, meat of some kind. I'm going to set up an area in the remote wilderness and have meat, probably ham, because cats have a very good sense of smell, and I think ham will attract them more than anything. Plus, I've got to think about economics here. It would be nice to use steaks, but I don't know if I can afford that many steaks. So I'm simply going to put bait out and wait overnight. Wait for these cats to appear in a nearby bush or something like that. That's simply how I'm going to begin. And that was always the problem with this next book of mine, because especially when it comes to things like the Loch Ness Monster, which I'm obviously very skeptical about compared to the big cats, which I know for a fact are real. When it comes to my account of looking for the Loch Ness Monster, that account may amount to nothing more than me trudging around in the darkness and wet and cold for 2 weeks around Loch Ness. So I don't know how you make an account like that interesting, but that's the duty of a writer, isn't it? But yeah, bait is how I'm going to start with these cats. Tate says, if these big cats are predators, you will require prey. I'm relying on their sense of smell. I'm going to put that ham out there, or whatever meat I use, and wait with a camera. And I must emphasize, although I'm going to call this book like something like Hunting Mythical Creatures or something like that for dramatic effect, hunting implies killing. I have no interest in harming these creatures whatsoever. I just want to obtain solid proof of their existence, i.e. good footage. And I'm certain I can do it. So yeah, that's how I'm going to proceed with that. So that's still going ahead. Okay, so before we move on to the main spiritual issue of this stream, I'm going to give my usual Bowie recommendations. I'm going through the David Bowie albums one by one. We're on 1972's Ziggy Stardust album. The full title is The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This is one of those albums that, you know, if you're a fan of a particular artist, there are some albums you get tired of hearing about, because Ziggy Stardust, well, albums like Space Oddity, which is actually just called David Bowie, albums like Hunky Dory, and especially Ziggy Stardust, if you ask someone what their favourite Bowie album is. If they're not really a fan of Bowie, they're going to say one of those albums. It's going to be Space Oddity, Hunky Dory, or Ziggy Stardust. It just is. And the Ziggy Stardust album obviously contains the song Ziggy Stardust, which is David Bowie's most well-known song. And it contains 5 Years, all kinds of songs that are really well known. But as ever, my two choices are far lesser known on this album. So my first choice is Soul Love. It's the second track on the album, and it's just a really nice song. I don't know, there's not much to say about these songs. It's just a really nice mellow song that has a lot of religious connotations to it, as even the name of it implies, Soul Love. The next song I'm going to pick is song number 6 on the album, which is Lady Stardust. And this song was written about a glam rock icon called was it Mark Bolan, who I believe died in the late 70s. But when David Bowie was writing this album in 1972, Mark Bolan was really well known, and he was instrumental in creating what is now known as glam rock. And so Lady Stardust is essentially about this guy Mark Bolan, and you can tell from the lyrics that it's about someone like that, because it talks about how they laugh at this guy for putting on this makeup and all this strange gear, but it's a really nice song. So that's my two choices, Soul Love and Lady Stardust, both of which are linked to in the description box below. Liam says, David, the Mammoth Book of Celtic Myths and Legends by Peter Beresford Ellis is a good book to have. Well, thank you for that recommendation. I will look that up. And I hope I've demonstrated by now that when people recommend things, I don't just give lip service to it. You know, when someone recommends a video, I do go away and watch it. When someone recommends a book, I do go away and look into it. So there's not much in the way of entertainment I'm going to speak about this week, because as I said at the end of the last live stream, I feel that sometimes I haven't got the balance quite right in these episodes. I want to talk about topical things because it's the only way to give any kind of online show longevity. But sometimes I don't get the balance right, and there's just too much of that kind of thing. I've got to bring the focus back to spirituality always. But another thing in entertainment terms is that the trailer for the new Scream film was released in the last week. And remember how I was recently talking about that sister's boyfriend of mine that was like a big brother to me when I was a little kid? He was the one who also introduced me to the first Scream film in 1996. And you know, how old was I? I was 12 years old in 1996, and that film scared me to death. And it was my first introduction to horror films, because as a kid I always loved sword and sorcery essentially. I loved Highlander, Conan the Barbarian, Willow, The Princess Bride, things like that. So Scream was my first introduction to horror as a genre, and everything else, when I went and watched everything else, you know, they paled by comparison. And so I remained a fan of the Scream films. What I like about them is that at once they're serious horror films in their own right, but at the same time they're a parody of horror films. They've always maintained that balance very well, I thought, and they're clever. They're ultimately who done it, you know, and so I really enjoyed that. So Scream 5 is coming out in January of next year, which should be really interesting. It's the first Scream that isn't directed by Wes Craven, because he died since the fourth film was released, and it looks really good. It looks really interesting. You've got Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, and David Arquette coming back to play the central roles. The thing I really don't like about it, and I don't care what their excuse is that it's not called Scream 5, it's just called Scream, so it has the exact same title as the 1996 film. Now, they have all kinds of excuses as to why they're doing that, and it's related to the fact that, well, the story is about the characters going back, yada yada, but whenever films lose their numbering like that, there's only one true reason for it, and it's the fact that the studio feels that to have a number like 5 beside the name of a film they think that less people are going to go and see it, because they're just going to look at it as, oh, look, Scream 5, just one more sequel. I have no interest in that. And you know what? They're completely correct about that. But that doesn't stop it being tremendously annoying for someone, because now you've got 2 films in the same series of the exact same name. It's just really awkward. They could have called it Scream something, you know, giving it a sub. If you don't want to have a number, give it a subtitle or something, but calling it the same thing as the very first film, it's not good. I don't like that at all. But I think I guarantee the film will be very good. I've just got that feeling. I know the film is going to be very, very good. So, as you can see, the title of this live stream is God Has Judged. And since the last fortnight has been a very reflective period for me, for some reason I was thinking about this week. It's not something that occurred to me, it's just a subject that arose to prominence within my mind for whatever reason. And it's the fact that individuals always talk about God's judgment as if it's something that he's going to make at some point. Like when they stand before him, with their mortal form having died, they're going to hear what God's judgment on them and what they've done and on this and that is going to be, as if he's just making it there and then, when obviously the truth is that God has already judged. As the title of this stream says, God has made his judgments, and scriptures like the Bible express this in many different ways. And like in the book of Hebrews, it talks about God being the same today, tomorrow, and forever. Because obviously, to put it into modern terminology, God exists beyond time. We have to get out of the habit of trying to understand God from the perspective of a linear timeline when God exists beyond time. God has already made his judgments on everything. And more than that, if he hadn't done so, then we couldn't receive guidance from him through our conscience and intuition. If you're doing something wrong, you wouldn't know it was wrong by listening to your conscience if God hadn't already decided it was wrong. God's judgment, his morality or ethics, if you will, they are set in stone because God does not change. He's an eternal being that exists beyond time. And so anything, if you ever want to know God's judgment on a certain thing, you just have to search your own conscience, which means that judgment in many cases is particular to you. And I use the example of vegetarianism, and the Apostle Paul speaks of this. The Apostle Paul speaks of those who will not eat meat as having a weak conscience. And I wouldn't put it like that. But what he's essentially conveying there is that what's right for one person may not be right for another person. It may be that someone's conscience does condemn them for eating meat, whereas another person's doesn't. And that's why you can't have these moral absolutes on such issues. It really is a case of listening to one's conscience. But then, of course, there are greater issues that anyone's conscience would condemn them on, because that's something that has nothing to do with their own personal spiritual journey and everything to do with God's moral law, if you want to put it like that. But God has already made his judgments, and what I found throughout my own spiritual journey is that, throughout my whole life in fact, is that we are ultimately always speaking in ways that are wrong because we're habituated into doing that. And I speak about this to some degree in my own book, where I talk about the fact that, if you are trying to reawaken to the reality of the divine, and you're really making a conscious effort, and you slip in some way morally, like the example I use in the book is maybe you're in a heated conversation and you snap and you get angry and you behave in a way that your conscience tells you is wrong. You shouldn't condemn yourself over that, because first of all, condemning yourself wouldn't do any good. You already know your own sincerity, and God certainly knows your sincerity. What that results from is your former patterns of behavior. You've been habituated into a certain pattern of behavior, and you're not going to get, because your mind has been habituated into those patterns of behavior, you're not going to get over that overnight. It's not as if you can make a conscious decision to know God and then they will all immediately disappear. No, you have to abide with God for some time before those patterns wind down. And that's why I say in the book, don't condemn yourself if that happens, because if your heart is sincere to know God and to change, don't let those things bring you down and make you feel defeated, because they are just reflective of old patterns of behavior that haven't run their course yet. That's all it's about. And so the same is true not just on moral issues, but also when it comes to the way we speak about things. We're habituated, obviously, we're habituated into speaking about things in a worldly fashion that is not true to reality, true to the truths and the greater realities that we've come to know. And so even now, I'll often find myself saying things just because I've been saying them my whole life, but I intellectually know, well, that's not technically correct because this is the truth. So I always make an effort to stop myself and think, is what I'm saying actually technically accurate according to what I know, or is this just some thing I've been habituated into saying? It's very important to do that. And this issue of judgment is a perfect example, because we talk about God's judgment as if it's future. And in one sense it is, because we individually have not stood before God in judgment yet, but God's judgments on all of these, on any moral issue, they have necessarily already been made, because that's the nature of God and therefore the nature of his judgment. Tate says, plot twist, we judge ourselves. And quoting from John 20:23, he says, whosoever sins ye remit, they are remitted unto them, and whoever so sins ye retain, they are retained. That's, what is that? The King James translation of that. The ESV version of that is, if you forgive people's sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven. And that's absolutely true. As spirit, this is the plot twist that Tate refers to there. As spirit, or rather as souls, we are individualized portions of spirit. We are spirit living out an experience of individuality. And since the spirit is God, and it's God that makes the judgments, we do in that way judge ourselves ultimately. And this is also the reason why, even if someone grows deaf to their own conscience and they don't hear from their own conscience anymore because they've sullied it, they've seared it, that doesn't mean they escape judgment, because when they die, their ego is no longer there, and therefore they have nothing to shield themselves from the full glare of their conscience. And as John says, the Apostle John said, darkness hates the light. And so what you have then is a soul that for its mortal life was protected from the light by its egoic identity, hiding behind it. But suddenly, when that egoic identity is gone, they're exposed to a full glare. And I said something on this matter in, I want to say it was chapter, it would have been chapter 3. It would have been in the section on conscience and intuition. And that was chapter 2 as it happens. Yeah, so what I said was, but the conscience specifically is not only that which urges souls to do what is morally correct, it is also that which condemns those souls that do what is wrong. For just as God guides, so too does God reprove. This reproving is no less a form of grace, however, for it is a warning that a soul is forsaking the spirit that they are. Maybe I should have said forsaking the knowledge of the spirit that they are. This is why the author of the New Testament epistle to the Hebrews, which, as academic consensus agrees, was almost certainly not the Apostle Paul. I knew it wasn't the Apostle Paul as soon as I read that book for the first time, because the writing style is just so radically different from Paul's letters. But the author of Hebrews writes in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 5 and 6, "My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one that he loves, and he chastises every soul whom he receives." Now you've got to think about verses like that from the perspective of someone who doesn't know what I've explained numerous times, the fact that God speaks to us through our conscience and intuition. If you're someone who doesn't recognize that, and you as a Christian read verses like that, you're going to be sitting there asking yourself, wait, I've never been reproved by God, and in what way have I been reproved by God? See, people overlook the obvious when it comes to spirituality. If your conscience is condemning you, you are being reproved by God. That is how God reproves you. It's just that the ancient Hebrews didn't use the same terminology that we do, and the way that it has been portrayed throughout history is very magical. So people sit around waiting for some magical spectacle, and they miss the obvious. They miss their conscience and intuition. That's God speaking to them. So this is where this is where I get to to those individuals who become deaf to their conscience and intuition. However, be aware that a soul becoming deaf to their own conscience does not mean that they are forever free from it. On the contrary, for the day will come when their mortal form perishes and they will have to face their conscience, face themselves, no longer able to turn away from God's corrective reproving. And this matter will be elaborated upon in due course. I think I returned to that in chapter 10 or something. So, yeah, as Tate said, we do judge ourselves from the highest perspective. Agoratos Henosis says, if I pass away, I want to ask about mysteries like JFK, the moon landing, Atlantis, and what will happen to humanity in the future. What would you dudes ask? I don't know. But I've thought about that before. I've thought about, is there some irony to me having this spiritual perspective, let's say, I'll put it diplomatically by saying spiritual perspective. Is there some irony in that, and then seeking to uncover earthly mysteries like these big cats and so forth? And I realised that no, there isn't. And the reason there could potentially be irony in that is because I obviously understand that I could, either when I die, it depends what God grants me. It's possible that when you die you won't have to ask anything because you'll flat out know everything, but it depends where you end up after you die. But let's just say when I died I could ask certain questions. If that's the case, then why even bother to do so here on Earth? Why even bother to uncover these mysteries here on Earth? And the answer, I quickly realised, is simply that what you learn in heaven after you're dead is no use to anyone on the Earth. And so by uncovering these mysteries while you're here on the Earth, you can essentially benefit your fellow souls in human form. But there's all kinds of things I want to know about. I'm someone... See this perfect example of what I was just saying earlier, that you get habituated into a way of talking and you got to catch yourself because what you're saying is not true. You know better than that. See, I was about to say, I'm someone who needs to know everything, but that's not true. That's just a silly figure of speech, almost. It's not true. In fact, one thing I emphasize in my book is that no, you don't need to know anything. Anything you need you already have, whether it's in terms of knowledge or anything else, because as spirit you are perfect, and it's just a case of recognizing that. Let's just say I desire to know many things. Yeah, I want to know what the truth behind the legend of Atlantis is, for example. That would probably be my very first question if I was in that kind of scenario. But yeah, Tate says, if you are concerned with worldly matters after death, you are likely to return. Exactly. So we've got to be careful that our curiosities, and there's nothing wrong with being interested in things, there's nothing wrong with wanting to know things, but if they become attachments, well, that's a whole separate issue. And so one always has to be conscious of that fact. So another thing that's been occurring to me a lot in the last fortnight, because I've been in this reflective period, is, you know, having just spoken about God's judgment and how it's already been passed essentially on all these issues, I've been very concerned with my own judgment, because obviously the easiest thing in the world is to think about, especially in the world of social media, is to think about how this scumbag here, that rat over there, is going to be judged, you know, or has already been judged rather, and the kind of feedback they're going to get when they stand before God. But it's very important that we don't always externalize that concern, that our priority is, you know, how are we going to be judged? You know, what kind of standing do we have before God? And of course there's that famous parable in the Gospel of Luke where the Pharisee is praying beside, was it a tax collector or some other form of sinner, as the Bible would have it, and the tax collector is thanking God that he's not like the guy next to him, the tax collector next to him, whereas the tax collector is saying, you know, God, forgive me, essentially. He's asking for forgiveness. So the Pharisee is saying, thank God I'm not like these other sinners over here, whereas the one that he's thinking is a sinner is the truly repentant one, because he's not concerned with anyone else. He's just asking for his own his own forgiveness for his own sins, whatever they may be. And I always try to be very conscious of that. Because what I learned throughout my life, since my spiritual awakening, is that, for example, remember early last year when I had that potential really serious health issue? What I found since my spiritual awakening was that, predictably of course, in times like that, that's when I'm really thinking about, what is my standing before God going to be? I do everything according to my own conscience, as much as I can, but you can't presume too much on God, I feel. And so it's always good to be conscious of that and make sure that you are doing things according to your conscience and that you're not acting egoically. But I, and most individuals, tend to really think about those things only when they're faced with death, essentially, potentially faced with death, because if they're faced with death, then they're faced with the prospect of having to go face to face with God very, very soon. And I became very conscious not to leave it to that point. I don't want, because that's folly of the highest order, to only worry about your standing before God when you're right before the threshold of meeting God. That's just a very silly thing. It's like another parable from the Gospel of Luke. Another parable that is unique to the Gospel of Luke, where you have that guy, although there's a version of it in the Gospel of Thomas, but you have that guy who stores up food in his barn, and he plans to keep it for some day, and he dies that very night, and God says to him, fool. He calls him a fool for not focusing on spiritual matters while he was still in human form, essentially. Although the biblical descriptions of a coming apocalypse and Jesus returning were particular to the first century, the fact is that death will come for us all like a thief in the night. Well, it'll come for most of us like a thief in the night. And we've always got to be conscious of that. So, yeah, that's the kind of thing I've been really reflecting on in the past fortnight as I've been in that, pensive mode, which, again, is fine, That's going to happen every now and then because we do need to recenter ourselves. So, I'm going to switch to the questions on Curious Cat now. And the first of these questions was actually, I should have been able to read it a fortnight ago. I apologise for that, but somehow I just completely missed it, but it was there a fortnight ago. Do you know anything about the Mesoamerican religions? The answer has got to be no, to put it simply, but the true answer is, and this is just a testimony to the nature of intellectual knowledge, is that I did. I used to know all about the Mesoamerican religions back when I was really fascinated with the subject of Atlantis. I was really concerned with the Mesoamerican religions because obviously the main idea, the core idea when it comes to Atlantis is that you've got this continent in the Atlantic Ocean, and when it was destroyed, survivors went east and west. Some settled in Egypt and other places like in Spain, but others went to Central America, and that's why at that time I really concerned myself with Mesoamerican religions. And all I can remember now is the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, and there was a Mayan deity called Calcum, but I can't remember what his purpose or function was, so unfortunately I've forgotten almost everything I once knew, which again is a testimony to the nature of intellectual knowledge. It can't be retained. Are you familiar with the story of Saint Juan? I don't know how to pronounce that. Saint Juan Diego of Guadalupe, I think. Juan, but not forgotten. Not really. All I know about him, see, this is the thing. When I'm looking at questions on Curious Cat, I try to answer them honestly. Obviously, whenever someone asks me anything on Curious Cat, I could just go and Google it and make myself look like an expert on everything. So, it's not that I'm being lazy when I respond to these questions and I just say I don't know. It's just that I'm trying to be honest as opposed to faking understandings. All I know about him is that, first of all, well, he's a Catholic saint as far as I know. He was supposed to have been born in Mexico in the 17th century, but there's some debate as to whether or not he actually existed, and I believe he's most famous for having visions of the Virgin Mary. That's all I know about that individual. How should I cope with fury? It's by recognizing that fury, let's just say anger, fury, variations, most would understand fury to be excessive anger. I mean, anger by definition is kind of excessive, you might argue, but they're in the same range. Either way, it's an emotion, and what's essential to recognize is that emotions are as dismissible as thoughts. And this is why in my book I go to such great lengths to emphasize the fact, I go to great lengths to illustrate a certain understanding of what we are. As souls, we are spirit undergoing experiences or journeys of individuality, but we are spirit fundamentally. Then there's our ethereal form, which is where emotions are felt. Then there's the mind, where obviously thoughts arise, and then we have the physical body. And it's important to recognize that, because it makes clear that thoughts and emotions are beneath what you actually are, and therefore you can have control over them if you want to. And I believe that I'm a perfect example of that. I'm a living example of how that is possible, because anyone will tell you that knows me, and this is another great benefit of me being on here under my real name, because I can't speak falsehood, because after all these years someone would have called me out by now. Anyone who knows me, or who knew me in my teenage years or early 20s, would know that I suffered from mood swings massively. I was really moody, I was often very emotional, very angry. I'm the exact opposite now. I'm always very calm. And again, I must emphasize that you can't ever get rid of your thoughts or emotions. You will always feel them arising within you. It's just a question of how you react to that phenomenon, essentially. And now I don't let those things overpower me. I've got power over them as opposed to them having power over me. So the way to deal with fury is the way to deal with any other emotion, which is to just disregard them. Meditation is the secret to this, because in meditation you're reconnecting consciously with the spirit that you are. And the more you get used to doing that, the more distance you build between yourself as spirit and lower phenomenon like emotions and thoughts. And therefore it's through meditation that you more easily dismiss thoughts and emotions. See, to most souls in this world in human form, it's inconceivable to them that they can just dismiss thoughts and emotions, because they assume that they are on the same level as them, that they're on the same playing field, or even worse, that those emotions and thoughts are them. And a large part of that is to blame on the materialistic understanding that is propagated throughout the Western world, but it's simply not true. And any mystic that has ever lived is a living example of how it's not true, because they gain mastery over those things. They wouldn't be able to gain mastery over such things if we were on the same playing field. In fact, this is the second time in this live stream I'm going to read from my own book, but I have to, because this is a very important subject. And I got straight to the right place here. Yeah, and I think I read this out very, very recently, but I don't think it can ever be repeated enough. The most powerful benefit... Okay, should I maybe start sooner? Okay, I'll explain the meditation I recommend and then jump ahead a bit. So this is the meditation I recommend. It's very, very simple. So I say, remember that consciousness is the spirit that you are. When the ancients used the word spirit, they just meant consciousness. And your focus is nothing other than the concentration of that consciousness, of that spirit, upon phenomenon. By phenomenon, I mean that which is phenomenal, such as thoughts and emotions, or things going on in the external world. Within meditation, you should allow your focus to relax back into the spirit from which it arose. The importance of being mindful of breathing within meditation, as has often been emphasized, is because your breathing is something that is necessarily always happening within the eternal moment. Therefore, focusing upon your breathing can help you to remain within the eternal moment. You will instinctively want to try and still the thoughts that arise within the mind, but attempting to do so necessarily means focusing upon them. And so although your intent may be to diminish their disturbing effect, you can only ever empower that effect. Instead, simply let those thoughts be. Let the same be true of any audible sound, bodily sensation, or emotion that may arise. Simply sit and be. In the beginning, you will feel pulled away from this practice to do all manner of things, because your mind is not engaged during meditation, and the mind gets very restless when it does not have a project. But this pull is just one more form of the phenomenon that you must not bestow your focus upon. With experience, not only will you no longer feel pulled away in this manner, you will actually feel pulled to meditation when engaging in the very activities that once drew you from it. This happens because you have come to know something of the immeasurable value and joy of abiding in and as the Spirit. So, to give an example from my own life, when I first started meditating, when I very first started doing it, I was immediately drawn away. I would be sitting there trying to meditate, and I would want to go and sit in front of this PC and listen to music or have a cigarette or something like that. But when I got used to doing it and I began to experience the benefits of it, let's just say, when I was sitting here listening to music and smoking a cigarette, I felt the urge to go and meditate. So again, it kind of reverses with practice. You might say that meditation is an acquired taste for the soul in mortal form, but here's the important bit to go to back to the main point to answer the question. The most powerful benefit of meditation is that the change in the way that you will experience external and internal phenomenon in your day-to-day life. For most souls, the impact and the effect of phenomenon is almost immediate. And so, for example, if something angers them, I used the example of anger, perfect for this question. If something angers them, that anger is felt as though it had leapt upon them. And with seemingly no time to react, they become angry. But the more that you make a point of consciously reconnecting with your true nature in meditation, the greater the distance there will be between yourself and any phenomenon that arises, whether they be thoughts, emotions, and impulses. Those thoughts, emotions, and impulses that once would have pounced upon you are now witnessed arising very slowly. This means that whenever a thought, emotion, or impulse arises, you will have ample time to recognize what it is, calmly assess the merit of it, and decide whether or not to indulge it. And I say that because there are plenty of emotions and thoughts you might want to indulge. Joy and happiness, you might want to indulge those things. There's no problem with that. All of this will happen, and all of this will happen because, having disciplined your focus to not immediately jump to any and all phenomenon within meditation, you have brought yourself into experiential alignment with the eternal moment, and so are coming to experience reality in the way that is most natural to you as spirit. It is precisely because mystics experience phenomenon in this way that they are known for their seemingly unshakable equanimity. I love that word, equanimity. Not only does it express what it should express, if you know what I mean, but it's a lovely word, equanimity. It is not that they no longer have thought, and this is a very important point. It is not that they no longer have thoughts, emotions, or impulses. They very much do. It is that they have achieved mastery over them. You must understand that there is a tremendous difference between perceiving such a phenomenon and being overpowered by it. And the example I give is, there is a tremendous difference between recognizing the presence of fear within oneself and being afraid, for example. To have fear within yourself is to have fear within yourself, but to be afraid is to have allowed that fear to overpower you, is what I'm saying there. But this distinction is subtle and is known only to those that have either considered the subject deeply or that have consistently engaged in the kind of introspective practice that I have just elaborated upon. When you have attained to such a degree of remembrance, you will no longer have to force yourself to meditate, for it will be a joy to you, and rather than having to engage in it according to a strict schedule, you will do so spontaneously. So the way to deal with fury is to meditate and become used to become reacquainted with your true nature, which is by nature transcendent to emotions and to thoughts and to all bodily sensations. And that's how you overcome fury, quite simply, and overcome everything else for that matter. That's how you overcome the world, as Yeshua put it in the Gospel of John, chapter 16. So, I'm struggling with the concept of becoming detached from group identity. What does that even look like? What does it require me to give up? There are things out there that when I see them make me want to fight. If one fights for worldly achievement, is he doing something wrong? Okay, I'll start with that last question there. Whether or not one is doing something wrong in spiritual terms by fighting for worldly achievement will depend what motivates that mission. And there's only two things fundamentally that can motivate one's mission. It's either the ego or God. One of those two. And so, if you're being driven by your ego to do things, then it's going to be, if not destructive, then simply unhelpful and might lead to a dead end. If you're being guided by God, on the other hand, then whatever you do, even if you don't understand it intellectually, it will be for the greater good, ultimately. And I can't believe I'm going to turn to this book again, but was it in chapter 7 it was. I make a point of emphasizing, because chapter 7 is about silence, and what I've just explained in the book is that you must surrender not only all ideas of yourself as a person, just forget about that, don't even try to explain yourself at all, sum yourself up at all, but also all intent. And in the final section, I talk about the fact that Yeshua, he had no purpose, he had no intent. And obviously, to open this section, I open every section of this book with a quotation from scripture, and I quote Yeshua from the Gospel of John saying, "I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me. If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true." So there Yeshua is saying that he's not doing what he's doing because he fancies doing it. He's doing what he's doing because God is instructing him to do it. And I love this last bit especially. If I testify about myself, my testimony is not true. He's talking about the ego there. If Yeshua starts talking about who he is from an egoic perspective, what he's saying is just nonsense. What matters is what God says he is. Very, very powerful, profound stuff, especially when it's understood in light of what I'm talking about here. The conscience, the ego, and so forth. So it may be that God wants you to do, well, first of all, in fact, why did I just close that? Because I go on to talk about this very thing. We are fulfilling God's general purpose by being here in the first place. If we didn't have a purpose in this world, we wouldn't have been incarnated in this world. And I say that very thing right here. Spirit manifested as innumerable souls so that it might know duality and limitation. Therefore, all souls are fulfilling God's general purpose merely by undergoing their experience of individuality. However, God also has a specific purpose for each soul within that experience of individuality, but it is not a purpose that can be fulfilled for as long as those souls seek to create their own substitute for it. And so when one is bound by egoic identity, they are necessarily going to make their own substitute for what God wants them to do. So again, it's less about what you're doing and more about why you're doing it. So it's less important that one is focused on worldly affairs and more important to ask what is driving that focus. Is it egoic or is it God? Have they said to God, tell me what you want me to be doing? I give up, I surrender all ideas about myself, I surrender all intent, guide me. And as I explain, the way that God's, in fact I'll just read it again, I'll just sit here and read this book. See, this is why I wrote this book, because I'm a better writer than I am speaker, and so, I wrote it so, so I say, when you first surrender your identity and intent to silence, you will initially feel somewhat lost because you have been habituated into following the whims of your mind, including those whims that relate to your destiny. But what you will find is that day after day, you will do exactly what you need to be doing. This is the way that God's destiny for us manifests, not as a vision within our minds of what we should be and what we should be doing in this world, but as a reality that manifests effortlessly before us every day. It is for this reason that while we will certainly have peace living out this destiny, we can only see the true brilliance of it in hindsight. God's plan is one that, due to our limited perspective, is only understood as perfect in retrospect. And actually, this goes back to the very first thing I said in this live stream, which is that I haven't done anything over the last fortnight. Intellectually, I was thinking, oh, I should be coding, I should be writing, but I knew through my intuition, no, it's not the time for that. It's the time to recenter. Just lie here reading scripture, which is exactly what I did. That's exactly what I'm talking about. My mind, the egoic part of me, wants to do certain things in the world, but there's that deeper part of me that knows, no, it's not. The time is not right for that. And so through meditation, you'll be able to discern more easily what is truly driving you, and that's how you determine what you should and should not be doing. But I don't think that most individuals struggle to understand when they're doing something from a selfish or egoic, for selfish or egoic motivations. So to return, I'm struggling with the concept of becoming detached from group identity. What does that even look like? What does it require me to give up? Well, the spiritual journey, as I say at the end of one chapter of this book, the spiritual journey, if there's one way to summarize it, it's that it's a gradual process of surrender of all things, surrender of one's own idea of yourself, because that's a conditioned idea that doesn't stand up to spiritual realities in the end. The idea especially that you're nothing but a flesh and blood human being. A surrender of intent, and once you've gone beyond those limitations, once you've overcome that initial conditioning, you see that you're too great an entity to be labeled as belonging to one such group, this group or that group. What you are is well beyond that. I can't believe it. I'm returning to this book again because I just remembered a certain paragraph I wrote that talks about this very subject. But I speak about the folly of trying to surmise ourselves. Because you can't. You're talking about us as spirit, and spirit is infinite. It can't be encapsulated in any way. So this is what I say here. You must never bestow yourself with a grandiose title or seek to conform to a particular image, or else your mind will make full use of the opportunity to begin investing in a new egoic identity. Before you know it, you will be dressing in robes, establishing a mystical order for initiates, and in all kinds of ways projecting the new egoic idea of yourself out upon the world. If you truly have wisdom and insight, then it will be obvious to all without such superficial displays, which, to those that actually do have wisdom and insight, will be seen as the desperate projections of a fragile ego that they are. This is why I never call myself anything like a mystic or anything like that. In fact, it makes me cringe and blush to even think about the prospect. But more importantly, is because if you bestow yourself with a title like that, it just gives so much room for the ego to start building upon that, and before you know it, you're doing all the kind of superficial displays. You know, I'm coming on here and I've got smoke rising in the background, incense burning everywhere, it's dark, and it's just putting forth this really egoic projection. It's putting forth an idea, it's putting forth a projection how I want to be seen by everyone else, which shouldn't be the concern for someone who is striving to overcome their egoic identity. So it's something that I emphasize in the book, but this is the most important point. What we are as spirit is beyond all words and beyond all concepts. We are that which perceives all human activity, all egoic identity, all mental phenomenon, and all ethereal phenomenon, which is to say emotional phenomenon, spiritual phenomenon, and everything else that can be encapsulated within word and concept. Therefore, regarding ourselves, let us remain silent, audibly and mentally. Then we are as spirit, formless and infinite. You will experience this as a liberation, and so it is, for you are free of the concepts that you have been a prisoner of for most of your mortal life, those things that gave rise to every sense of deficiency that you have ever felt. Having experientially verified the power of silence as your identity, you will naturally find that it begins to permeate your existence until you not only abide in and as silence, but also exude it in your day-to-day life. Now, I also emphasize in the book, as I should do now, that there's no need to be ridiculous about this. Obviously, while we live in the world, we have to present ourselves in a certain way. So if you're going for a job interview, for example, and they ask you who you are and what you do, it's just not clever to give them a vague mystical answer. If you're writing your Twitter bio, for example, you can talk like a human being. This goes back to what the Apostle Paul said about being all things to all men. You have to speak to individuals according to their level of understanding. You can't speak in this high mystical way, otherwise you can't function in the world. But in these live streams, obviously, I am speaking in that high mystical way because it's warranted. I'm just saying not to go crazy about it and not to take it to ridiculous extremes, because we do have a role to play in this world, and other individuals, other souls out there with their level of understanding won't understand if you try and speak according to these high mystic truths. But what does it even look like to give up group identity? It's hard for me to even answer that question, because I can't remember what it's even like to be bound up so strongly in a group identity. But what it would require you to give up is, it's your own egoic identity, because without that egoic identity, there can be no other attachment on top of it, if you know what I mean. So as I said before, as souls in mortal form, when we're born in the world, the first piece of egoic identity we have, the foundation of egoic identity is our birth name, the name we're given at birth. And the reason for that is that every other piece of conditioning that we acquire as we age physically, it's heaped on top of that name. And so to speak that name is to evoke the whole identity. And as I explain in the book as well, in that same chapter, that's the reason behind spiritual names. Because conditioning is built up upon a given name, the purpose of spiritual names is to help a soul to detach from that egoic identity that they've been attached to for their whole lives. That's the true purpose of spiritual names. So we're given a name when we're in human form as children, and we acquire egoic conditioning as we grow up. We learn that we have an age, a number that increases every solar year. We learn that we are either male or female in terms of our mortal form. We like this music, we like that music, and we have all of these group identities. So the way to free yourself from group identity is to look at who exactly you take yourself to be, because without an erroneous understanding of who and what you take yourself to be, i.e. some form of egoic identity, you won't be attached to those kind of group identities. So that's what I would say in response to that. Oh boy, this question. What are your thoughts on governments coercing people to get the COVID-19 vaccine? So maybe this individual has only recently started watching these live streams. I think it's currently the greatest manifestation of evil in the world, quite simply. And funnily enough, the reason I was thinking about this issue of God having already judged things was precisely because of what's going on around the world right now. All of these petty tyrants that are trying to impose these measures. Now, I'm here on YouTube, so I can't go into certain things, and I wouldn't speak in medical terms anyway. But what this is about, fundamentally, and the reason they're trying to coerce so many people to get the vaccine, well, first of all, it's obviously not about it's not about a virus with a 99.6% survival rate for everyone below the age of 70. It's nothing like that. And I think above 70, the last time I checked, the survival rate was 97%. It's not about that. What it's about is introducing a vaccine passport that can then be expanded into a social credit system. And the reason they're so concerned about everyone getting the vaccine, as many people as possible, and the reason they're doing all of these despicable things to coerce and basically force people to get a vaccine, is because if there's a significant portion of the population that doesn't have the vaccine, and that portion of the population is largely fine which is and will continue to be the case because we're talking about an extremely minor virus here, then it essentially destroys the legitimacy of the vaccine passport and therefore scuppers their plans for this larger social credit system. As I've been saying from March of last year, from the very beginning, this is about money and control. Money for big pharma and control for every government around the world. That's what all this is about. And so that's my thoughts on that issue, quite simply. I say thoughts, but look, I've been right about this from day one. I'm going to continue to be right about this because it's the most obvious thing in the world. That's what this is really all about. So my thoughts on it, it's one of the most despicable, it is the most despicable evil that is at large in the world today. This is an attempted coup, essentially. In all kinds of ways, this is all kinds of things. It's a transfer of wealth from the poor to the wealthy to make them even more wealthy, the way they've crushed small businesses to profit behemoths like Amazon and so forth. There's all kinds of ways that this is, but this is an attempted coup. This is an attempt to change society fundamentally and to usher in what they are now openly calling the Great Reset, essentially. The Great Reset for the new normal, which is only going to benefit the powerful ultimately. What do you think about secular types arguing for having empathy as the foundation for morality? I think it's very flawed because obviously one's empathy is not universal. One's empathy is not unprejudiced. So you're obviously going to have empathy. You're obviously going to naturally have more empathy for someone you're related to, someone you're in a relationship with, a friend of yours and so forth. But even aside from family and friendships, there are people you meet in the world sometimes, and for whatever reason, on a personal level, you just don't like them. And then there are other individuals that you do like. So most people are going to have are going to be more naturally inclined to have empathy towards the person that they, for whatever reason, like more on a personal level. They just resonate more with them. So that's not a good measure of morality. This basically arbitrary empathy that we extend out to individuals that we happen to like. I just don't think that's a good thing. And I think, especially in the modern day, with the heightened tensions, as it were, politically speaking, you see this on social media. Does it look like empathy is a good measure of of morality or of a way to treat people? No, because we see time and time again that individuals will be completely calloused towards those that that disagree with them politically in the most minor way possible. Like, even in the most minute matter, people will disregard other individuals, and they will have no empathy for them. And I was just talking about the vaccines and the vaccine passports and so forth. Prime example of that. Look at the way that individuals are talking about the unvaccinated just now. Where's their bloody empathy? Now, the problem is, if you don't know God, then you don't know empathy. You're not capable of true morality. And this is another example of where the atheist and religionist debate is silly, because they're both missing the point. Because the basic gist of this whole debate about whether one can be good, morally speaking, without God, it's all built on a false premise. Because for the most part, this debate is being had between individuals who don't accept the reality of a monotheistic God as portrayed by some religionist somewhere, and on the other side you've got someone who thinks that morality should be established by a book, namely the Bible in the case of Christians, both of which are completely wrong. You can't have a perfect morality that is based on a book of any kind. I don't care whether it's written by the most brilliant scientist or by the wisest mystic that ever lived. A book or any collection of texts is insufficient for morality. The perfect moral guide is our conscience. That is the only guide we need. And that's what's going to lead you to do the right thing, because whereas your empathy is rather arbitrary, your conscience isn't. Your conscience will condemn you if you treat someone lesser because they disagree with you on a certain matter. Your own thoughts won't do that, and your own sense of empathy won't do that, but your conscience will. So I don't think that empathy is a good foundation for morality at all. What are your views on the current state of the gaming industry? I think that it's gone the way of Hollywood, in that, in so many ways, in fact, you know, I'm a big proponent of not supporting those that hate you. And we all know that the Hollywood elite, as it were, they have nothing but contempt for the likes of you and I. And so I'm a big believer in not supporting those individuals in all kinds of ways. And I feel the same is true of gaming. These industries and so many more, you know, they were established, they were built by, let's just say, individuals of a different nature than those that now dominate them. So in the case of gaming, you know, throughout the 80s and the 90s, you had the bedroom coders, and they were really the foundation of the whole gaming industry. Now it's being taken over by individuals of a certain persuasion, and they're not concerned about the gaming side of things. Most of them don't even know anything about video games, much less how to code a video game. They're not the kind of individuals who would have that the kind of work ethic and, frankly, intelligence required to do that. What they always do is subvert those works that other individuals make. And by this point, Hollywood and the gaming industry, they have been fully subverted. And so what you find in gaming now is that indie gaming is very, very popular because it's not dominated by those kind of individuals that gamers just are alienated by and don't have anything in common with. Those individuals that just want to lecture people more than they want to make good games, make games that individuals want to play. So that's what I think of the gaming industry. I haven't liked it for a very long time, the mainstream gaming industry. Games journalism is dire, as all journalism is dire. So there's a reason that when I play a video game, in all likelihood, it's going to be one that's 20 years old, because I just not interested in so much of what the mainstream industry puts out in the modern day. And if it's not 20 years old, it'll be something from the indie section. Do you have any interest in paleontology? You mentioned Atlantis a bit. What can you tell us about Calcum? I've never had any interest in paleontology specifically. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an archaeologist, but that's only because, you know, I watched Indiana Jones. So I never had an interest in paleontology specifically. But as far as Calcum goes, yeah, of course I can say something about that. Calcum is best known as that substance that Plato said the Atlanteans had. Plato said that this metal substance, Calcum, he said it glittered like fire, and what the Atlanteans would do is adorn their buildings with it. But here's what most people don't know. I mean, most people don't know about Calcum in the first place, but what even less people know is that Plato wasn't the only one to reference Calcum. It's largely accepted that Calcum did exist as a substance. We just don't know what it was exactly. And the reason we're sure it exists is because it wasn't just Plato that referenced it. There were other Greek writers. Was it Pliny, I think, referenced Calcum? Virgil, he referenced Calcum. And they all had slightly different descriptions of what it was, but they all agreed that it existed. I think it was, I just said his name and I've forgotten, not Virgil. I just said his name and I've completely forgotten it. But the other one I said, I think it was him that said that the reason Calcum fell out of favour is because the Calcum mines, they ran out essentially. They ran out of Calcum. Which is strange because Calcum, as described by Plato and every other writer, is an alloy. It's a metallic alloy. Now, typically, a metallic alloy is an alloy. It's more than one metallic substance combined with another. But the fact is that you can get naturally occurring metallic alloys. They do actually exist. So it's possible that Calcum was some kind of naturally occurring metallic alloy, and it was Pliny. Yes, thank you, Tate. It was probably some naturally occurring metallic alloy. According to Plato, in Atlantis, Calcum was second only to gold in value. So it was very valuable, it just wasn't as valuable as gold. But I guess it would be now because Yeah, according to the early Greek writers, they essentially mined it out, and it's gone now. Actually, I remember seeing a news story. There was a ship discovered in the last few years, a Roman wreck it was, and they discovered some blocks, so some metallic blocks in it, and they thought they'd discovered orichalcum. They thought that orichalcum had been rediscovered by the world for the first time. Unfortunately, in the end, it wasn't well, how would you know if you found orichalcum? That's a problem. But they found that it was some kind of alloy, essentially, and not as exciting a discovery as it potentially could have been. Do suicides go to hell? I'm thinking that if one could not overcome despair in life, why should death do away with it? Speaking of self-murder, what do you think of Dante's Divine Comedy? Thoughts on Halloween as well? Suicide is no solution to any problem. Now, I'm curious. I'm looking at my book again for my sake this time, because I did speak about this in one version of my book, and I can't remember for the life of me whether I cut that section out or not. I think I did. I think I cut that section out for some reason. But I basically pointed out that, as the individual said, suicide is no solution because the challenges that you're being presented with are intentional. You're being presented with those challenges to overcome them, to see if you can overcome them as a soul living in human form. And so if you simply kill yourself, then you're just going to meet those challenges again, maybe even in a worse form. So suicide is no solution. Is it a sin? Well, it's a sin in the sense that it's missing the mark, which is what the sin means. And I have to emphasize that because sin has all kinds of other connotations, but sin just means to miss the mark, to not do things right. And certainly suicide in that sense would be counted as a sin, because it's not a solution, because you have to meet those challenges. It's part of your spiritual development to overcome whatever challenges you're faced with. And I want to say it in that way so as not to bring issues of judgment into it. I don't want this to be emotional at all. It's just a simple fact that if you kill yourself as a way to avoid certain challenges, you'll simply face them again. What do you think of Dante's Divine Comedy? I honestly don't know anything about it. Thoughts on Halloween as well? I don't have any particular feelings. Tate, suicide, restart the level without reaching the checkpoint. I don't have any particular feelings on Halloween. Certainly not the type to go on about how it's satanic or anything like that. It's just one more human festival. But I am, of all the holidays, it is my favourite. Not as a holiday, but just because of the time of year, because I'm a creature of cold and darkness and ice, and so I love Halloween, the Halloween season. I love October, November, December. I love those months because they're dark and they're cold. It's my favourite time to go out there and to go out and about. That's really all I can say. I don't have any special feelings on Halloween. I actually really love Halloween as a kid. I love scary monsters and things like that. How often do you do evil runs in video games? I don't really have much time to play too many video games in the modern day because I'm focused on doing so many other things. But historically, and just for anyone who doesn't know, an evil run in a video game, well, it can mean many things. Like if you're playing a game like Grand Theft Auto, an evil run could be you just kill as many civilians as possible, you just cause as much havoc as possible, or it could be in the context of like a role-playing game, you make the evil choices. But historically, I've not done that in video games for two main reasons. First of all, I'm not inclined to do that in the first place. I'm inclined to do the good way. I am one of those individuals who actually finishes games that I start playing. One of those rare individuals who finishes games that I start playing, but I don't often play a game more than once. And if I'm going to play it just once, then I want to do it the good way. The second reason is that most games that give you that kind of choice, whether to be good or evil, the evil choice is clearly the lesser choice. The game is typically not designed around that choice. So you can make an evil choice, but it's almost always better to make the good choice. You'll get more efficient gameplay out of making the good choice. So no, I don't really play the type of games that you could really do an evil run on in in any way. There are certain games I really enjoy, games that are among my favourites, that cast you as a morally dubious character in the first place. I'm thinking of like the first-person shooter Blood from 1997. You play as the anti-hero Caleb, who's an undead cowboy, and although you are fighting bad guys, this evil cult, you yourself, you're not really a good guy either. So that's all I can say to that. I don't often do evil runs in video games because historically I haven't, and in the modern day I just don't have that much time to play video games anymore. One thing I said on Twitter this week, just the other day, I said, in this world, the deceit is so total and the lies go so deep that your only hope for navigating your mortal life effortlessly is to learn to listen to God as he speaks to you through your conscience and intuition. It was true 8,000 years ago, and it's true now. The reason I said 8,000 years ago is because that's when the first acknowledged major religions arose. Tate says, the evil thing to do in the perspective of a video game would be to switch the game off, ultimately once your time and energy invested. Yes, that's very, very true. On a similar subject, some of you may know that the newest trailer for Batman has just been released. This new Batman film. And yeah. See, I'm not a fan of superhero films. I'm not just don't appeal to me. But I do like Batman. I will almost always watch a Batman film. But kind of along the same lines of what Tate was, I think, getting at there, is that, man, there's just some people that are just way too into that kind of thing. And I say that because I've watched some of the reaction videos to this Batman trailer. You know, I'm not trying to be judgmental here. Maybe it can't be avoided, but I don't know, when you've got this 40-odd-year-old guy and he's almost crying over the latest trailer for Batman, it's, we can't say what life God has planned for him, but I don't know. I think this culture. Well, I always see, that's another example of what I was saying earlier, where you're habituated into saying things. I always say, I think this, I think that. Sometimes it's not that I think it, I know it. It's that to an extent in this culture, we're all broken to a degree. And as someone who comes from what would be called a broken family, I understand that more than most. Because as I've said before, my mum and dad, they split up when I was like 6 years old. So I'm from what would be considered a broken family. And I in hindsight, can see the ways that hindered my development. And you can always ask yourself, if this hadn't happened in my life, if I hadn't come from this background, what would I be now? You know, what kind of individual would I be? Because of the way that families have been, that the family unit itself has been so splintered in the Western world over the last 6 decades. We are all, to some extent, I think, products of a broken society, and we are not what our ancestors might have been at some point. And so that's why I don't want to be too judgmental of anyone, because I understand that I think most of us, if not all of us, because of the kind of society we've been raised in, there is that sense of the what you might call delayed development. We are immature for longer than we might have been if we'd lived in a different time period. If you look at individuals like George Washington, for example, you know, look at him at the age of 20. What had he achieved by that age? You know, compare that to the average individual growing up in the Western world now. It's, you know, when you look at figures like that from the past, there's obviously something different now, and I don't think it's just to do with the fact that they didn't live for all that long, typically, and therefore they've got to cram it all in. I think it's there. I think if you grew up in the Western world, you almost certainly have a stunted development to some degree, and that's why I'm trying not to be too judgmental on anyone, because we all suffer from this to some degree, and to a degree it's just a result of the environment we were raised in. But that's what I don't like. See, as much as I enjoy video games and as much as I enjoy films and I like talking about them, there's that other side of it where people just invest their lives in it. And what I think is the worst part, and this is more true of films than it is of video games, is that they act as if they are part of like Warner Brothers or whoever is putting out this film. They act like they are part of a studio in the way that they talk about things, when they're not. They're just being duped by a studio. So if you go and look at the reaction to this Batman film, you'll see all these grown individuals getting really emotional about it, really expressive about it. And some of them have, the DC Verse logo on their channels. And it's not as if DC is paying them to do that. They're just doing that because they're massive fans. And these big companies have successfully tricked them into venerating them somehow. So in the case of these superhero films, you've got this Marvel versus DC thing, and one group is Team Marvel and the other group is Team DC, but they're all tools for these different entities who ultimately only care about getting their money. So yeah, it's like the Buddha. This is why the Buddha established the middle way, so that this Marvel and DC thing wouldn't come about. But the Buddha, the middle way, Buddha understood. And it's always great to have an excuse to talk about the Buddha. So just in case anyone doesn't know the story of Buddha, I don't know why that's funny. Don't know why I'm laughing. So, Siddhartha Gautama, that's his real name. The Buddha is just a title. Okay, I've just thought of 10 other subjects now. So, Siddhartha Gautama, that's his name. He's called the Buddha, but in Buddhism, Buddha is not an individual. Anyone can be a Buddha. And the Gnostics thought of the term Christ in the same way, because the term Christ just means anointed one. And whereas in mainstream Christianity there is one Christ, namely Yeshua, in Gnosticism the point was to become a Christ yourself. Tay says, please enlighten us on the Buddha. So Buddha, a Buddha can be anyone, but Siddhartha Gautama, let's just say the original Buddha, as Buddhas are well, see that even that's not true actually, because there would have been technically Buddhas before him. So let's just say Siddhartha Gautama. He grew up in great wealth, and he was a prince. And by the way, just as with Yeshua, there are all kinds of stories surrounding Buddha, but I'm just giving you the general overview. It's kind of like, if you're telling someone the story of Yeshua's ministry, which gospel do you speak from? Because they've all got little differences. The same is true of all these accounts of Buddha, except to a much larger degree. It's ridiculous. All these different canons. Gee, you think the Christian canon and the Gnostic canon is complex? Just try and look at the Hindu or Buddhist canons. It's ludicrous, especially for a Westerner who's not used to these exotic sounding names and terms. It's so baffling, so confusing, and I don't pretend to be an expert in any way, shape or form. But I do know the story of Buddha very well. And he was a prince who grew up in wealth, and his parents desired to shelter him from the suffering in the world, as every parent does their child. And there's a nice little metaphor in there about how you can't ultimately do that. But there's that famous story where one day Buddha has this attendant, and his attendant takes him out, and on one occasion he sees I believe it's a poor person or a hungry person, and I think so that's good because he's grown up in wealth and he's been sheltered from the outside world. It doesn't even occur to him that someone can be hungry and poor, so he's shocked by this. Then the next time the attendant takes him out, I believe he sees a diseased person, and that shocks him as well, because living in the palace he's got the best care. He didn't know anything about disease. And on the final time the attendant takes him out, he sees a corpse cart going along the road. someone's carrying a corpse, someone has died, and Buddha has been so sheltered, he wasn't even aware of mortality itself. So Buddha is suddenly faced with these realities, specifically, to sum up, the reality of suffering, which is what Buddha ended up concerning himself with. And so he became concerned with this suffering that he'd never been exposed to before, and he became very disaffected. Like any spirit, the story of Buddha, just like the story of Yeshua, it's the quintessential story of a spiritual seeker who was what like in the Matrix, Neo in the Matrix. They were asleep at one point, but now they're awakened to reality, and they realize there's something wrong, and they need to find the truth via the red pill, as it were. So even though Buddha is married and has a child, he abandons his child and his wife and just leaves into the wilderness. And there's so many parallels between Yeshua and Buddha. Like Yeshua, Buddha goes out into the wilderness and he's seeking enlightenment. And whereas in the Christian stories of Yeshua, Satan tempts Yeshua, there's the same equivalent in Buddhism. There's this demon called Mara who tempts Buddha throughout his life, especially when he's really close to enlightenment. So Buddha goes out to find enlightenment, to discover the solution to suffering, to find out what it's all about. And he inevitably encounters all kinds of gurus out there, bearing in mind that Buddha himself was a Hindu. Hinduism existed for approximately 2,500 years before Buddhism arose. So Buddha encounters all of these Hindu gurus, and they're trying to discover enlightenment in all these different ways. And they still do over in India now, all these different gurus. There are some who are overindulging themselves, there are some who are inflicting pain upon themselves, there are some who are starving themselves, and Buddha tries out all of these ways, essentially. He tries out all of these extremes of mortifying the flesh and gluttony and all these different ways as a means to find enlightenment, to find out what the answer or the solution to suffering is, what the higher truth is. And none of them work for Buddha. And there's a point where he is starving himself and he essentially looks like a skeleton. And he knows that this can't be right, so he gains enlightenment under what a Bodhi tree ultimately, and he learns what he comes back with. First of all, what happens in at least one story is that after Buddha has gained enlightenment and he's overcome the temptations of the demon Mara, the companions he'd been with, that he'd been starving himself with, they find him and Buddha sitting there eating a bowl of rice. So his companions think he's failed in the spiritual quest. They think he's weakened and he's fallen to temptation and all this. But then Buddha starts to explain to them, no, I just realized that there has to be balance, and this is where the middle way gets established, that it's useless, and the Apostle Paul said the same thing, it's useless to mortify the flesh, but it's also not good to overindulge yourself. There has to be a balance in everything. And so that's what Buddha begins teaching. He begins teaching the middle way, and it gradually accrues followers, and the rest is history, as they say. We have Buddhism, but I'm always conscious to keep the same balance when it comes to entertainment, like video games and films. It's one thing to enjoy them, but when your whole identity, especially, I was about to say your whole life, but especially what's even worse is your whole identity is wrapped around them, that's where things have clearly gone too far. That's right, Tate. The bowl of rice was overturned by a young girl. That's right. I remember that now. Weird how you remember that detail, and when you said it, because of all details to remember, that's true. What are your thoughts on Nietzsche's Antichrist? Honestly, I know very little about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is like Julius Evola, one of those figures whose name is often evoked in right-wing circles, but I honestly know very little about. Red-haired Gibbon said, people are also increasingly suffering from information overload in the West. Oh yes. Overstimulation from smartphone footage and social media is harming many people's psyches. Absolutely. For the last time in the stream, I'm going to return to my book on this subject. The only problem is, I can't remember at all where I wrote about this. I'm sure it would have been in the chapter No, it wouldn't have been actually. In fact, I think it was in chapter. Could it have been chapter? No. I don't know. Where would I have said this? It was in some place where I was talking about how in the modern world where, well, I said what you just said essentially, you know, where there's too much information available to us. And even on a physical level, you know, we are not evolved, if you want to put it like that. We are not evolved to absorb so much information. We just aren't. You know, if you want to speak in evolutionary terms, it's like the technological progress and advancements that we've made, they took our mortal forms by surprise, if you like. We weren't ready for this, and so it's no wonder that all kinds of mental afflictions are so prevalent throughout the Western world, because that's why people benefit so much from taking a break from social media. Here we are. In a world where souls are more connected than ever before, there has never been more phenomenon vying for their attention. Within an hour of waking up, a soul can be exposed to the knowledge of a dozen different atrocities that occurred around the world, and all of you have had the experience of focusing upon a particularly outrageous incident only to end up being outraged yourself as a result. For some of you, this is a regular and perhaps even a daily occurrence. A soul may even watch or listen to material that is uplifting, informative, and perhaps even pertains to the spiritual, but they have focused upon that same material many, many times before. It has become the intellectual and emotional equivalent of a comfort food that they return to gorge themselves upon time and time again. And that latter point is something that I have been particularly guilty of in the past, is that it's like an intellectual comfort food. There's just certain things that they're not negative things, you know, they are ostensibly positive things to be watching or listening to. The problem is I've watched and listened to them like 1,000 times, and I'm just doing so now out of habit. I'm not benefiting from them anymore. I'm not moving on to newer or higher ground. I'm just reabsorbing that same information. So the way I'll end this live stream is with another little story about Buddha while he's on my mind. It's one of those legends that arose concerning his death, which is I find very interesting, and I think there are different accounts about his death, but I remember this story stood out to me for a particular reason, which you'll understand, is that one account of Buddha's death is that, well, he died of poisoning because what happened was one of his followers gave him a bowl of food to eat, but the food was off to some degree. It was off and it wasn't good, and it was essentially lethal. It was so off. And so this follower who really loved Buddha, he gives him this bowl of food, and Buddha knows perfectly well that the food is off and will kill him. But, and this is obviously an allegory or a metaphor or a little fable, basically intended to convey just how loving Buddha was, essentially. Even though Buddha knew that the food was spoiling or would kill him, or would otherwise kill him, he took it and ate it anyway, instead of offending this follower that loved him. And the point is that Buddha would rather literally die physically than risk offending this individual who had the best of intentions and who loved him, and so he took the food and died. Just one little story concerning Buddha's death. But I think I'll end things there, so thanks very much everyone, and I'll see you the next time I do a live stream.